There are stories that take a lifetime to be ready to tell. Not because they are painful or scandalous or wrapped in the kind of complexity that demands careful management before public release, but because some experiences are simply too important to risk cheapening with premature words. Too formative, too genuinely sacred in the private architecture of a person's life, to be handed over to the noise of public consumption before the speaker has fully understood what they are actually trying to say. Hayley Mills has spent decades in that particular silence. She has given thousands of interviews across a career that began in extraordinary fashion and has never truly faded. She has spoken warmly and generously about her famous father John Mills, about Disney, about the films that made her a beloved figure to multiple generations of audiences. But on the subject of Maureen O'Hara, the woman she stood beside on a Burbank soundstage in the summer of 1960, while filming one of the most celebrated family films in cinema history, she has been, until recently, unusually guarded. Now, at 79 years old, she has finally decided to speak. And what she has chosen to say is not what anyone expecting backstage drama or Hollywood gossip will find. It is something rarer and, in its way, far more worth hearing. To fully appreciate what Hayley Mills is describing when she speaks about Maureen O'Hara, you need to understand the profound difference between the two women who arrived on the set of Disney's The Parent Trap in 1960. What each of them had already seen, survived, and become by the time the cameras began rolling. Hayley Mills was born on April 18, 1946, in London, the daughter of the celebrated British actor Sir John Mills and the playwright and author Mary Hayley Bell. She grew up in a household where the arts were not an aspiration but a daily reality, where extraordinary talent was a familiar presence rather than a distant ideal. She made her film debut in Tiger Bay in 1959, at 13 years old, delivering a performance of such unexpected emotional precision that it earned her a BAFTA nomination and brought her to the attention of Walt Disney himself. Her performance in Pollyanna the following year won her a Special Academy Juvenile Award, the Oscar-equivalent recognition for a young performer of exceptional achievement. By the time The Parent Trap began production, she was already famous. But famous is not the same as experienced, and brilliant is not the same as formed. She was beneath all the talent and the recognition, still a teenager, still figuring out the difference between performing in front of a camera and understanding the industry those cameras existed within. Maureen O'Hara had already lived 3 careers' worth of that understanding. Born Maureen Fitzsimons on August 17, 1920, in Ranelagh, County Dublin, she had been performing professionally since childhood, studying at the Rathmines School of Commerce and the Dublin Peacock Theatre before being spotted by the legendary actor and director Charles Laughton, who brought her to Hollywood. She made her American film debut in Jamaica in 1939, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, and her career trajectory from that point was one of the most sustained and impressive in Hollywood's golden era. She delivered iconic performances in How Green Was My Valley, directed by John Ford in 1941, in Miracle on 34th Street in 1947, in Rio Grande and The Quiet Man alongside John Wayne. Films that between them represent some of the most beloved and enduring work in classical Hollywood cinema. By 1960, she was not simply famous. She was a monument. She had navigated 4 decades of an industry that systematically undervalued women, fought for her own creative dignity against studio executives who preferred compliant performers, and emerged on the other side of all of it with her integrity fully intact and her reputation not merely preserved but enhanced. When these two women, the teenager at the beginning of her story and the woman who had already lived hers fully, encountered each other on a Disney soundstage in Burbank, the outcome was far from predictable. Hayley Mills has spoken candidly in recent years, in interviews with publications including The Times and Radio Times, about what it felt like to stand in Maureen O'Hara's presence for the first time. There was nothing deliberately intimidating in O'Hara's behavior. She was not cold, not dismissive, not the kind of established star who signals to younger colleagues through carefully managed small cruelties that the hierarchy is fixed and they should know their place. She was simply, and this is the precise quality that Hayley found so overwhelming, completely herself. Utterly secure, possessed of a certainty about who she was and what she was doing that radiated from her without effort and without performance. O'Hara was a tall woman with that famous copper-red hair, a voice shaped by decades of stage training and Irish landscape, and a physical presence that made rooms feel organized around her without any conscious effort on her part. She walked onto a set as someone who belonged there not because a studio had placed her there, but because she had earned the right through 40 years of exceptional work. For a 16-year-old actress, however naturally gifted, however celebrated, sharing space with that quality of presence was, Hayley has acknowledged, a quietly overwhelming experience. She was not frightened, but she was profoundly aware, in those early days of production, of the distance between where she was and where O'Hara had arrived. What she did not initially anticipate was how generous O'Hara would turn out to be with the experience that created that distance. Because the thing that transformed the dynamic between them was not time or familiarity in the conventional sense. It was O'Hara's active, deliberate decision to treat the younger actress not as a pretty teenager playing opposite her, but as a serious professional whose development was worth investing in. The conversations that happened between setups and during lunch breaks, and in the quiet moments that accumulate over weeks of production, were not structured mentorship sessions. They were simply two performers talking about acting, about the industry, about what it meant to sustain a career across time rather than simply burning brightly for a season and then fading. But for Hayley Mills, they constituted an education that no drama school could have replicated, because what O'Hara was offering was not theory. It was hard-won, specific, personal knowledge. She spoke, Hayley has recalled, about the craft of listening, about how the most important thing an actor can do in any scene is genuinely hear what the other person is saying, rather than simply waiting for the moment to deliver the next line. She spoke about finding the truth inside a character rather than indicating the surface of one. The difference between showing an audience that a character is sad and actually allowing yourself to access the emotional reality that sadness represents. She spoke about discipline, about the years of work that underlie the moments of apparent ease that audiences see on screen, about the relationship between preparation and freedom. How the more thoroughly you have done the work before the camera rolls, the more genuinely spontaneous you can allow yourself to be when it does. These were conversations between equals in craft, even if they were not yet equals in experience. And O'Hara conducted them as such, without condescension, without the slightly exhausting patience that experienced performers sometimes inflict on younger colleagues, without any implication that she was doing the teenager a favor by sharing what she knew. She simply shared it, because she respected the work and recognized in Hayley Mills a young woman who took the work seriously. One piece of advice in particular has stayed with Hayley Mills across the full length of her adult life. During a break in filming, O'Hara turned to her with the directness that was characteristic of everything she said and told her. In words Hayley has recounted in multiple interviews, that she must know who she is before the world decides for her. It is the kind of statement that sounds almost simple in paraphrase. But Hayley Mills has described returning to it again and again across the decades, each time discovering a new layer of meaning as her circumstances changed. The pressure of transitioning from child star to adult actress. The scrutiny that came with a public life. The particular challenge of maintaining a private sense of self when the public version has been constructed and circulated without your full participation. O'Hara had navigated all of those pressures across 4 decades of her own career and had arrived, clearly, at a place of self-knowledge so solid that it required no external maintenance. The advice was not abstract wisdom. It was a map drawn from personal experience, offered to someone who would need it. What Hayley Mills has wanted people to understand about Maureen O'Hara, the thing that she has been most careful to communicate in speaking about her after all these years, is that the legend and the person were the same. There was no gap between the Maureen O'Hara who appeared on screen with such commanding presence and the woman who sat across from her during lunch breaks and talked about Dublin, about her early stage work, about the collision of cultures that accompanied arriving in Hollywood as a young Irish woman in the late 1930s. She was, by every account from those who worked with her across her career, including John Ford, who directed her in 5 films and considered her one of the finest actresses he ever worked with, exactly who she appeared to be. Proud, principled, fiercely independent, and possessed of a sense of humor that, in Hayley's recollection, was one of the most disarming things about her. Large, unguarded, entirely genuine, the laughter of a woman who had made her peace with the world on her own terms and had nothing left to perform. O'Hara would tell stories between setups about her adventures on location with John Wayne, who was, she made clear, one of the great friendships of her professional life, with a storytelling skill that reminded everyone within earshot that they were in the presence of someone who had genuinely lived a remarkable life rather than simply observed one from a distance. Hayley Mills has described the particular quality of O'Hara's laughter as something close to freedom. In an industry defined by careful self-management, by the perpetual calculation of how one is being perceived and what one should project, there was something extraordinary about a woman who simply did not operate that way, who had earned the right through 4 decades of exceptional work to be entirely, unapologetically herself, and who exercised that right without fanfare. The friendship that grew between them during the production of The Parent Trap was never the kind that generated publicity or filled gossip columns. It did not express itself through dramatic declarations or public gestures of solidarity. O'Hara was by nature a private person, one whose deepest loyalties manifested quietly, in a hand on a shoulder before a difficult scene, in a word of honest encouragement offered without ceremony, in the simple but profound act of paying genuine, sustained attention to the people she respected. And she respected Hayley Mills. That respect, communicated without sentimentality, but with complete meant more to the younger actress than any amount of public recognition. The lessons that Hayley Mills absorbed from Maureen O'Hara during that production and in the years that followed were not only lessons about acting. They were lessons about being a woman in an industry that has historically not made that easy. Hollywood has never been especially kind to women regardless of their gifts, and it has been particularly unkind in the way it encourages competition between women. Treating solidarity as naivety, collaboration as weakness, the presence of one successful woman as automatically threatening to the prospects of another. What O'Hara demonstrated by her behavior toward Hayley Mills was a living refusal of all of that. Here was a woman who had every conventional incentive to protect her own position at the expense of a younger colleague. Every reason to be guarded, to withhold, to maintain the distance that seniority in Hollywood typically demands. She chose, instead, to be generous. Not because she was a saint, but because she had reached a point of genuine self-possession at which pettiness was simply not interesting to her. She had larger things to care about. That demonstration of what was possible, that a woman could move through a long, demanding, and publicly scrutinized career without surrendering either her integrity or her compassion, is something Hayley Mills has carried with her through all the complicated years of her own life. The transition from beloved child star to adult actress, which Hollywood has historically managed with something between indifference and active hostility. The personal choices that came with living in the public eye. The long negotiation between private self and public image that never quite resolves itself when you have been famous since your teenage years. In all of those moments, the memory of Maureen O'Hara functioned as something close to a compass. Maureen O'Hara passed away on October 24, 2015, at her home in Boise, Idaho,